I'm going to say welcome to the Together 2023 Disability Film Festival and to taking stock of disability film on International Day of Disabled People. We have live captions available from Global Real-Time Captioning and British Sign Language interpretation from Chris Burrow. Please let us know in the chat if you have difficulties in accessing these. I'm Ju Gosling, the festival's artistic director, and I'll be chairing this afternoon's discussion. I'm a white woman with pale olive skin and green eyes behind black plastic glasses. I'm wearing a black pork pie hat over short-headed hair, and I'm wearing a sort of thick purple hoodie because it's quite cold in the UK this weekend. The Together 2023 Disability Film Festival takes place thanks to funding from Arts Council England, Film London and National Lottery Community Fund. Please can you support them to continue supporting us by completing the survey that will appear at the end of the session. We look forward to seeing your comments and questions in the chat. Let us know in the chat if you need access to your camera and microphone to communicate, or else I'll read out your questions and your points. I'm delighted to say that I'm going to be joined today on the panel by representatives of BECTU, the UK's Media Production Union. Carwyn Donovan works for BECTU as Negotiations Officer, and Rhys Miles Thomas is the Equality Representative on the South Wales Freelance Branch Committee. Before I introduce Carwyn and Rhys, though, I'd like to highlight that as part of the festival, we've launched a new online resource, Filming Disability, a guide for filmmakers and editors. You can find the guide on our website in the resources section, and I'm delighted to say that it's already been endorsed by Film London, Film Oxford and Bigger House Films, and is currently going through the democratic process, as it so rightly should, at BECTU. This year, the Together 2023 Disability Film Festival received more than 1,700 entries from around the world. It's extremely encouraging to see more films being made about disability. However, many films portrayed disability as a tragedy or used other negative stereotyping, with happy endings apparently very hard to imagine. Stories were often told through the eyes of non-disabled people or non-disabled people with the subject of the film, rather than the disabled people they work with or care for. Inevitably, this also limits distribution opportunities for these films. We hope that our new guide will equip filmmakers and editors with the knowledge they need to make successful films with the widest possible distribution. But before that, we want to talk about what needs to change. And part of that is to include more disabled people in film production, which is where BECTU comes in. So I'm going to switch on the spotlights. Welcome, Carwyn.
Well, good afternoon, or I should say from Wales, Prynhawn Da. Thank you, Joe, for inviting BECTU along to another year or another festival for such an important conversation. And it's a privilege to be joining you on the International Day of Disabled People. To describe myself, I'm a white man in my mid-30s. I've got, I think I said to you last year, I've got a lot less hair in my head than I did when I started doing the job. I got a bit of stubble on my chin, and I got some blue eyes behind some black plastic glasses. And I'm wrapped up in a nice warm jumper over a shirt because it's a particularly chilly couple of days, or it has been in South Wales. It's a bit wetter here today, but it is an absolute privilege to be asked back once again to feed into such an important conversation. Just to briefly explain to anybody joining us today, BECTU is the union in Britain it's the trades union in Britain for those working in the creative industries. So not just film and television, but things like theatre and live events as well. And part of our role, as it is the role of all trades unions, is to engage and to progress conversations like this to ensure that opportunity is extended to all, but to remind people of the opportunities then that in doing so, the opportunities we have to broaden our understanding of each other. I'm privileged to be joined by Rhys Miles Thomas today, who is one of our representatives in the South Wales Freelance branch, one of the branches that I look after. Rhys, I don't know whether you want to say a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, firstly, can I echo what Carwyn just said? Both bore da, pnawn da, and to also say what a privilege it is to be a part of this community, because I'm a member of your community. I'm disabled myself, but I'm a writer, director, and yeah, just to what you described myself, I'm a white mid-40s male who's got a little bit more hair than Carwyn, but I'm trying to hold on to it. I'm wearing my glasses, I'm wearing a black top and white background. And yes, it's just a privilege to be here to talk to you and to discuss a very important subject. The representation of disability on the screen is such a brilliant opportunity at the moment, but it's such a contentious issue that that I think that we all know that they don't get right, and we have the power to put it right, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a great, powerful message to start with. I'm just looking at where we're gathered together from, and some of the people introducing themselves in the chat. We have Beth is from Baltimore, Anna is from Hamburg, Midnight is from Newcastle, Mikala is in Iowa, Petra's in Michigan, Christine's in Canada. So it just gives you a sense of the fact that, what's been wonderful about being forced into becoming an online festival is this ability as a community to come together, not just the handful of people who can get to the UK for a particular festival, but to be able to kind of meet. And also, I think when I look at in-person festivals, still, I think the filmmaker events take days and days and days, and perhaps we just don't have that amount of time anymore. And it's easier to kind of find an hour to have a conversation across time zones. But I just think it's so valuable and such a pleasure to see you all. Thank you all so much for coming. So keep putting your points. Don't just introduce yourself. We really want to know what you've got to say. If you're deaf or you otherwise don't want to type, then put a message in the chat and we'll pop your camera and microphone on to allow you to make that contribution in person. So yes, I think our starting point is we've never had more films submitted. We had 1,763 films submitted, and most of them were actually eligible. Whereas previously, if we've had a huge number of films submitted, quite a lot of them have just been somebody's been pressing a button going, oh, this festival's free to enter, I'll enter it. My film's better than any of those disabled people's films anyway. So we still get a handful of those. We certainly get people who go, well, my film's like a metaphor for disability. So we do say in the guide, no, there's no such thing. Please don't send us those films, because we're legally obliged to look at every film that's submitted. And it really is a bit of a waste of our time. But mostly these were proper, would be defined as disability film. But overwhelmingly from not just some parts of the world, but overwhelmingly in some parts of the world, we're still seeing it's so miserable to be a disabled person. Oh, what a tragedy. Let's voyeuristically look at the minutiae of this person's life, because after all, they don't have the right to any privacy. And we'll look at what a tragedy it is. And I'll come back to the sad music, because I think that's been a wider curse. But it was really quite extraordinary how many of these films are still being made and how long they are. because I think all of us as filmmakers and anybody else who's run a festival knows the longer a film is, the harder it is to program, the harder it is to keep an audience. And in the world of TikTok and social media, it's become, there's a real expectation that you tell your story as quickly as you possibly can, or if not, you're going to have wonderful cinematography to be spacing it out a bit and keeping that audience's attention. So an hour and a half of unrelieved misery is not what I would call a commercial film in any sense. So that would be the first takeaway from that. We also saw a real new trend in drama, which was rescuing disabled people. Again, none of these films are in the festival. And I really wouldn't want to be having a go at any filmmaker, because I think it's about improving the representation. But my assistant said, why are so many disabled people being kidnapped this year? She said, it is such a theme, you know, around the world, people are independently making these films about disabled people being kidnapped and needing to be rescued. Now, I don't know if COVID is actually driving this rescuer complex, but rescuer complex is clearly out there, and that's not something we've seen before. Again, it's not reflected in the dramas that we're screening, but I would suggest there isn't a huge market out there for films rescuing disabled people either. You know, possibly nobody even cares about rescuers. What did you think about that, Reese?
I completely agree with that point. And just to pick up on your point beforehand, is that I think there's a misconnect of people not really applying for commercial films, for films that will be popular, films that will be entertaining. You know, it's because of this picture of disability as being a depressive, sad, terrible situation that a lot of filmmakers are doing now. They're never going to reach a wide audience. And I think that that's a problem that we as disabled people can you know, stand up and make our own films as well. Sorry about my cat.
So I've got hundreds around here, well, that's what it feels like, but I've got 5 trying to get on camera.
But also I think that I think the wider community needs to realize that actually, as 25% of the audience in Britain anyway, then that's a massive audience that want to see great and uplifting films, not disability porn in that sense, but something that's a positive outlook, you know, and our lives. Well, as a disabled person, I enjoy my life. I don't sit there in the darkness crying all the time, and obviously I have bad times, as we all do, but that's able-bodied people also have bad times. You know, it's not reflective of who we are, and if we don't have a positive outlook out there, then the general public are just going to think of us as being these sad, depressive people in the corner.
Yes, I mean, we've got some, I mean, I think there's a real trend towards individual profiles, which I'm not sure I'm so keen on, but we've got some great individual profiles because it's looking at, well, so-and-so's an actor, so-and-so's a dancer, so-and-so's have wanted to be a vet but had to become a Paralympian because they wouldn't let her register. So-and-so was training to be a doctor when they became disabled, and guess what, they still became a doctor. You know, so-and-so's a surfer. You know, it's about, and I think that's one of the things we say in the guide, everybody's life is interesting. You know, we don't sit around thinking about our impairments. We don't even sit around thinking about the barriers we face. You know, the focus of our lives on a, you know, maybe one day, you know, certain days, of course, that's what we're focused on, but most of our lives we're not. And I think these films that just go, oh, it's so interesting because this person's disabled and I've never seen a disabled person before. I think the figures that the International Paralympic Committee give is that worldwide, even with a very young global population, 16% of the world's population is disabled. So that's a very high proportion, rising to 20-25% in countries like the UK. Disabled people are always going to be in the audience. And I'm really not, there's always this well, not always, but a lot of the films, particularly films that we rejected, seem to assume that the audience is like, I'm a non-disabled filmmaker and my audience is non-disabled. So I'm just going to have this, and they're having a conversation that they don't realize is going to be offensive to certain members of the audience, because it doesn't occur to them that because they don't have any disabled friends, disabled people aren't, they just don't see disabled people in society. I think there's also an issue about disabled people being invisible. Now, I'm going to pick up some points here. Somebody's saying, could we put a link to the guide in the chat? Now, I thought, yes, it is. If you go right to the top of the chat, I think Sam will post it in again further down, but we have got a link in the chat. So, yeah, and it's very much a live document. So we very much welcome, feedback. Julie Newman, our chair, says, does that bring us back to the discussion about what is disability film? I suspect the disability misery films are a lazy interpretation, not allowing for the joys of creativity. It's really difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think if you're a filmmaker within a culture, and I don't mean a national culture, I just mean a personal culture that says disability is extraordinary and unusual and sad and miserable, and I'm going to go and kind of, put a microscope to this disabled person, then it isn't just lazy. It's about, they don't want to make, that's not the starting point of their film, is somebody's joy and their happy family life and their very successful career. Carwyn.
Oh, thank you, Joe. Look, I just wanted to, support what you and Rhys were saying there, okay? I think for me, the most unedifying element of this conversation, of the way in which disability is represented on screen then, is that it's put forward as the element of disability is put forward as something that defines somebody, okay? And that's the tragedy for me, that that is very often the least interesting part about somebody's life, isn't it? That people, disabled people, have just as much of a story, or just as many interesting things and remarkable things that have happened to them, which have nothing to do with their disability, and that we can. I'll speak a bit about the guide and how that will help, to broaden people's horizons on that fact. But I think that is the tragedy, that we want to be including more, disabled representation in film and television, which is exactly what in how it is in society. And that is completely normal.
That's right. I mean, I think there's the first two short films in today's documentary programme, and I won't name check them because I'm notoriously bad at getting the names completely right. But they're two short films from Australia. They're both about young disabled people who are training to become filmmakers and presenters, and indeed are making films and presenting TV. They're great documentaries. It also made me think, why don't we have those projects in the UK? We have had those projects in the UK, but I think austerity has, well, whatever excuse or name they give to the cuts, I think cuts have been progressive. There's all sorts of things that make it now much more expensive to run a training project for young disabled people, including or people of any age. But there does, I mean, I don't know what you found or what your kind of perception is in the union, but it does seem to me, looking at the film festival entries, that there's far fewer coming through from the UK in terms of publicly subsidised training projects for young people or people of any other age. And yet we've got some great ones showing from places like Australia. I mean,
I think that I think for me that the problem is at the moment is, or one of the problems is, that disability seems to be focused on in front of the camera. So it's talent in front of the camera. It's not actually, to truly make an inclusive filmmaking experience, then you need disabled crew, you need disabled writers, you need, you know, the whole gamut. It's not just about putting one or two disabled people in front of the camera. And I think that that's one of the things that we are lacking in the UK is that actually having that sort of disabled crew really at a high level, not just, you know, coming in as researchers or runners or whatever, you know, that they are the decision makers, they are the people, you know, heads of department, etc.
Indeed.
I'll come back to you in a sec, Carwyn, but I just wanted to say the best advice I'd ever had when I've always been disabled, but when I realised I was disabled because my access needs had increased, was from Bectu, who said, well, you know, if you pretend you're not disabled, you know, then you're just going to piss everybody off because you're just not going to be able to do the things that they expect you to do. And it's going to be very difficult for you to get to director level. But they said, you know, but I mean, this is going back about 30 years, but Bectu said to me, you know, as a director, there's no reason why you shouldn't direct as a disabled person, whatever your access needs. And I think that's the point. You know, it's for some people, it's going to be quite hard to do some jobs in the team, but everybody can direct. You know, we have a great film in the dramas today by, now I think I'm going to get Greg's name right, Greg Moran. Try to pronounce, I can see the film's name, but trying to pronounce it, Kol Sedai. Well, you know, Greg is quadriplegic. He's written the film, directed the film, organized the shoot. You know, he's a very experienced filmmaker. There's nothing that would stop us directing other than other people. And I think that's the reality. I mean, Julie was saying that she agrees with Reese completely. I'd love to see some more comments in the chat along those lines. Yes, the BFI, the British Film Institute, are notorious for having equality targets for their funding. And usually what then happens is the figures come back and it's like 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, which is, yeah, pretty appalling because it just goes on year after year after year after year. But I think besides that, there have been, you know, from mostly BFI funding again, individual schemes to train disabled filmmakers, but they're very much short-term projects. And what seems, certainly in terms of entries to the festival, there seems to be almost nothing taking place really since 2020.
Well, I think that's a problem I've experienced as well, is that you become a tick box. You become, so we're given an opportunity to a disabled person to shadow on this. I've just been shadowing on a Sky One drama, and it was excellent and it was great and everything, but it was a short-term period and that was it. You know, there's no support which was just going on from there. You know, obviously, you know, I'm not saying that I haven't got the power to actually stand up and well, I haven't got the power to stand up, but to actually get out there and put my name around and things like this. But I would say that the companies and production companies and channels, definitely in the UK, are being at the moment sort of paying piecemeal to disabled people, so giving them an opportunity, or we giving them that opportunity, we don't have to do anything else. And that's, you know, it's crazy because it's got nothing to do with the actual industry itself. You know, I want to work for years. I don't want to just do 6 months and that's it.
Yeah, now Shay Ellick from Canada is making a very important point here. She says, within Canada, one of the things we're finding is that it's getting easier to get disabled writers into writers' rooms. So working on series, for example, but it's almost impossible for them to continually work and get recurring contracts after the first one or two. And it's that same kind of thing, isn't it? Oh, we've ticked a box So we can say that we've had some disabled people here, but we don't really have any long-term commitment. We just want to tick the box. And Sarah Lee from Inclusivity Films is saying, agreed, it often feels like a tick box exercise and production companies not wanting to put access lines in budgets. And we've discussed, I won't go into sort of huge detail here because I think we've discussed it at a previous festival, but certainly the kind of, when you have an industry where everybody's been expected to work 16-hour days and use the most basic possible transport, you've already got a problem in terms of employing parents and employing disabled people. I tend to feel if it's got state subsidy or it's got a big Netflix budget, then access should absolutely be built in as standard. You just don't have the excuse that a student filmmaker has. Carwyn.
Yeah, thank you. Look, just to come back to what Rhys was saying, yeah, it's absolutely important that we get, disabled actors to play the roles of disabled characters. And that helps to ensure that, the portrayal is respectful, doesn't it? But I think, as Rhys was suggesting there, the key is including people with disabilities in the filmmaking process then, and script writing, casting, for instance, and that ensures then that we've got accurate and authentic representation, going into the what the story is about. I think I can certainly understand why people are feeling, that this is some kind of tick box exercise from the engagers, and that's a source of dissatisfaction from of the trades unions, and has been for many a time. What we want is a complete, authentic strategy then that ingrains disabled workers into the industry, that better reflects the makeup of society. I think it's depressing for me to think then that one of the greatest leaps forward we've made in accessibility, and today is an example of that. I never thought that I'd be speaking to people from Alberta, Canada, from my living room on a Sunday afternoon a couple of years ago. I just never thought that'd be possible. But you take it then. I spent many years of my career then arguing for accessibility adjustments, things like flexible working agreements to ensure that people could be, could have reasonable adjustments that would allow them to do their jobs as is permitted, as is secured, I should say, by UK employment law. Spent many years arguing with employers who would be at pains to assure me, or try to assure me at least then, that the job we were talking about, the job in question, it was not able for you to do that job from home. And then the pandemic came along, and overnight, everybody had to do their jobs from home. Not everybody, I accept there were some jobs, and, I pay tribute to those hard workers that still, had to go out and make sure our public services, etc., run during those days. But I thought the point I'm making here is that it is the will then to adjust jobs to the extent that's necessary then, which is, I would hope that wasn't necessary. The pandemic for me said that, we had to do things, we had to do them, and when we have to do them, we can do them. So I think it has opened up the opportunities for people, but there is still, a long way to go. And that's why, trades unions are so important for me. Well, it was the trades union movement that, when I say the trades union movement, the labor movement, I'm conscious my colleagues in America will be more akin to that term then. But in Britain, the labor trades union movement then was linked to, the Labour Party, the government then, that enshrined the right of disabled workers to have reasonable adjustments, but it was those progressive conversations furthered by trades unions that have secured that legislation that allows people, you know, the dignified adjustments that they, you know, that make all the difference to people then. So
I think
that's,
so. I'm going to stop you there, Carwyn, because we've got more stuff to come in. I think that's right. What I want to go wind back slightly. Jemima Hughes is making a really important point, who says, I really agree, but I think there are barriers to reaching that level, as in becoming a director. Jemima says, I wanted to do a media BTEC and do the film options. I used assistive technology with switch access for computer and communication. And they said I couldn't be assessed if I couldn't use the camera independently. It's really stupid. Directors don't all hold the camera. We didn't try a big fight about that because it didn't feel as though the college were going to be positive about my support needs. Maybe things have changed now, but I think it's hard for people with a lot of support needs to access training and courses. I mean, absolutely. And the only reason I'm slightly skimming over this is because we have discussed it at the festival before, but I think things have got worse and not better. Together 2012 is rooted in the main Paralympic host borough for London 2012, that is, of Newham. And Newham has an absolute ban on disabled people coming in to do media courses at level 1. Now, level 1, for anybody outside the UK, is supposed to be a qualification open to people who've not got any qualifications. But no, they won't let people in. And at the other end of the scale, where we have seen a young person manage to, by moving different areas, because this is a national problem, if not an international problem, you know, you get to university if you can finally manage to do that, which is an extraordinary achievement. And then the learning support that's being paid for isn't there. So, and then if you manage to graduate with a film production degree, you've actually got into the BTEC and you've got into university and you've managed to graduate, you then discover that everything you get offered is unpaid. The shadowing, the internships, and that means you can't access to work funding. So I've had more than one conversation with young disabled filmmakers who've got wonderful degrees, made wonderful student films, and they're stuck at home all day because they cannot progress because there's no funding for the placements that they've been offered. And then, of course, I've also come across young people who've then gone, oh, well, we're doing the shoot up on the top floor and there's no lift. And you just think, you know, you've dragged somebody in a wheelchair over there. So thank you for pointing that out, Jemima. It has to be said that Jemima is an multi-award winning animator who, you know, very clearly, you know, probably is far better at any of these things than anybody teaching that course. Christine says the industry thinks they want to include us until they realise inclusion requires personal responsibility, not just accessible buildings, inclusive until they have to behave inclusively. Now, Sam has very helpfully, because Mikala asked about what a tick box exercise was, and apologies, I'm using English and not more common English. But Sam is saying the definition of a tick box exercise is the fact of doing something just because there is a rule that says you must do it. A lot of what the care home inspectors do is literally simply ticking boxes. So yes, it's very much about saying, well, you know, the funders really want me to have employed some disabled people, so I'm just going to employ some disabled people or fund some disabled people, tick the box to say that I've done it, and then I'm just going to forget about it again, I think is. Emma says, I'm doing a PhD, been a mature student for 20 years and agree with you that things have got a lot worse. So, yeah, now I'm just skidding back. Julie Newman says, sustained funding is heartbreaking when it isn't available. The negative impact of short-term funding coming to an end is not sustainable, in as much as the next round of project funding, which has to replicate the learning and training that's already been given, plus the loss of potential talent, is like trying to fill a leaking jug. Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the problems with projects is that you've just got to re-recruit the people, re-recruit the leaders, repeat the same curriculum instead of progressing people on, and then you've got to sit around unpaid raising money again. Shay Ehrlich is saying, I'm curious if there are disabled-led film training initiatives in other places that has been slowly taking root here as we can get funding for them. There was recently an accessible writers' room project here in Canada, and more that's in the process of being developed. I can certainly recommend these 2 Australian films at the beginning of the documentaries project. 104 Films in this country has intermittent project funding for disabled filmmakers. I'm not sure how many years it is since they last did.
Sorry, Jude, just to pop in there. 104 have got a scheme open at the moment for new disabled directors for feature films, I think.
Brilliant. So they've managed, yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing. There's 104 get BFI funding every so often. Bigger House Film, who've endorsed the guide, they get training funding, but again, it's very kind of, well, it seems to me, they may tell me differently, but it seems to me that it's not very continual or involving many people. Film Oxford, who support Shadowlight artists who presented with us yesterday, that's Arts Council funding. It's not even film funding. And indeed, Oscar Bright Film Festival, which is a biannual film festival for people with learning difficulties here, they are, you know, that's only funded every 2 years, and that's Arts Council funding. You know, the film industry doesn't even recognize, you know, we have some Film London funding, but most of our funding comes from Arts Council England. So I think there's almost more of an interest in the sort of acting side, you know, which is more arts funding. And again, it's that kind of, is it behind the camera or is it in front of the camera? Beth Haler says, my friend Dom Evans, who is a disabled director, screenwriter and media consultant, directed a music video from his bed in Michigan in 2021. And she's put a link in of the article and also, yes, also the film. Tyler says America has very few funding opportunities outside of private companies, and the ones that exist are profoundly competitive. And I think that's the other thing we found. It's like, well, if you've got very few opportunities, inevitably they're going to people who are, yeah, whiter, male, are better educated, or unless it's targeted. And then it becomes that tick box exercise again, and people kind of leave that project and are still back to kind of sitting around in their sitting rooms. But I wanted to move it on a little bit because we are taking stock of disability film. And the biggest issue for me this year, apart from, well, if we get rid of all of the miserable films and all the films where disabled people are being kidnapped, what we're still left with is a huge amount of miserable music. And I've literally never heard so much piano music and violin music, but particularly piano music, as I've heard going through the entries this year. I think the growth of copyright-free music has led a lot of people making low-budget films to put music into their films for the first time. And I'm here to say, please don't, would be my kind of overwhelming thing. I've got various kind of personal hates, and my biggest personal hate is sticking music behind a voice when it doesn't need to be there. Because if you've got any kind of condition that makes it hard for you to focus on the sound, as soon as there's 2 sounds to focus on, it becomes much harder to understand the film. And the worst examples I see, not so much in the festival, but more generally now, are people using what I would call slideshow music. So the kind of music that Apple plays on your computer when it, oh, let's look at some photos from the past, even though you don't want to. We're just going to suggest you do that first thing this morning, and then the music starts. Well, that music really is there instead of a voice. So if you put that music with a voice, what you're signifying is this person really isn't important enough to listen to. You actually need some music. So you've already kind of really kind of, you know, you've made it harder to hear that person. And if it's slideshow music, you've also suggested that that person isn't really worth listening to in the first place. But most of the soundtracks have been certainly in the festival, a degree above that, where people have gone out and specifically chosen what I think is mostly copyright free as opposed to composed music. But it doesn't seem to matter what the film says, which is one of the reasons the guide is also aimed at editors. You can have incredibly positive content in the profile of the disabled person, but do, 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 do. And it's just terrible. There is such dissonance between this person talking about their active, kind of happy life and this sad piano music. I think what really summed it up for me is Wendy Belcher, who's one of the Shadowlight artists who were presenting yesterday. Wendy wasn't able to be with us, but Wendy had an entry in the animation program yesterday. No, the artist film program. It was an animation, but we put it into artist films specifically because it deals with a difficult subject, which is bereavement, loss of a pet, grief over her dog. And she used the sad piano music. And I thought, yes, Wendy, that's when it's due to be used, in a sad story. But I knew perfectly well that, huge numbers of filmmakers who entered our festival would have used that music to make a film about Wendy. They wouldn't have seen Wendy as the filmmaker. And they wouldn't have seen that actually that music should be reserved for the death of a pet and not the life of a disabled person. So that was a really big issue for me. Now, Beth Haller is saying that an initiative in the USA is to hire disabled musicians to score films, and has put a link in. I'm really interested in that. There was one film, which I won't name, but it was a deaf film. And in theory, the deaf person was talking because you either saw them sign or you saw the captions for what they'd been saying. But in reality, the filmmaker had robbed them of their voice. They'd taken away all of their vocalizations and they put a composed soundtrack behind it instead, with lots of high frequency notes. So there was no, if it had been music reflecting a deaf person's experience and the experience this deaf person was talking about, it would have been percussive. But no, it was lots of high frequency violin music. And it was as if the filmmaker, again, was assuming that everybody in the audience was non-disabled and had perfect hearing. And they were telling, and they were sort of telling the story for us within the music. So it really didn't seem to make any difference. And then culturally inappropriate music. We've got a great Ukrainian profile, which I do urge you to watch the documentaries program. But where was the Ukrainian music? No, it had to be more sad piano music. Programs or films about people of color. Do we have appropriate music for what they're talking about? No, we're back to the sad piano music. So I think there's a real scourge for the sad piano music. Now, this is a really important point. So I'm just going, so from Kirby says, I wrote the music for a film submitted this year about an autistic girl and her musical journey. And I wanted to write a song about being autistic from my perspective that was joyous and celebratory, because this is also a huge pet peeve of mine. Hire a person who knows what your film needs. It will make a huge difference to your project. And yes, and I think that's the reality. If you look at the films made by disabled directors, you will find very different situations, unless you've got deaf directors where sometimes there's been music put in that I just don't believe reflects things at all. Petra says, our disabled queer production team is going to have a festival viewing party of today's dance program online in a few minutes. So that's great. So she's jumping off now. But Petra says, I'm in the process of writing grants for our new Crypt Drift project, which has both 2D and 3D, meaning kind of lots of deaf and disabled involvement. All of these grants are within universities, and that's really the main money I tend to get. One of the films in the festival has some funding through an European Artist in Residency funding, but overall our films have budgets below $2,000. And I think anybody who knows Petra's films, and no, I'm going to forget the name of their collective, but they certainly look like they're made by a lot more than $2,000, because they always have audio description and they always have captions included, which of course would prove my point that access is not expensive. But again, I think it's really interesting that people have to go to the university sector to be able to make it a film that's led by disabled people. Beth is saying, my organisation, the Global Alliance for Disability in Media and Entertainment, has a toolkit about representing disability on screen. Thank you for that link. And she says, how do we get it to more people internationally? I don't know, but I'd love to put a link in at the bottom of our guide, because I think the more we can build up the resources, the better. It really is just a start at the moment.
Stu, can I just
yes,
jump in
Reese.
about I agree with you about the music side of things. I think one of the problems that I've encountered are that you have non-disabled editors put in library music or be they non-copyrighted music, and they choose, because they haven't got the experience, they see, oh, it's a disabled person, I'll put, it's a sad piece of music, I'll put that on. So I think that there's a place for us as filmmakers as well to insist that we have more control in that edit, alongside having disabled editors who can relate to what's happening on the screen and know that it's not a sad piano music moment, but it's a joyful moment. And but they automatically see someone in a wheelchair, will give them piano music.
Absolutely. And I think that's part of the problem. You know, we're a collaborative, you know, film is a collaborative art, and things can fall down at any stage in that collaboration. And yeah, absolutely. If you don't have people involved, or disabled and deaf people involved the whole way through, then I think it's a really big issue. I mean, something else that I've picked up this year is that people have started becoming, on the one hand, it's easier to get captioned versions of films. But on the other hand, people have started shoving their films through YouTube, downloading the file and sticking it up as captions without checking it. Now, of course, voice recognition does not do well on, you know, on names of places, names of people, you know, foreign accents. It just doesn't do well, and that's just a fact. So that kind of inclusion has to kind of go through to the audience, doesn't it?
But definitely, I'm sure Carwyn can relate to this, but as Welsh speakers, English speakers put things through Google Translate and just put them up on the screen. And one bit that went up was translation. I can't remember what the English translation was, but the Welsh translated piece came to, I'm sorry, I'm away from my desk at the moment. I'll be back on Wednesday. And that got put up on the screen as a kind of a subtitled thing. And so yeah, definitely, you know, please don't rely on YouTube to subtitle your pieces. There's plenty of AI software out there which you have to check, obviously, but
yeah, I think that's the thing. I mean, I think it's great that people have got, you know, can use YouTube to generate timed captions, but you have to check them. And I think that's that kind of, oh, well, I've ticked the box that says I have a captioned film, and you're thinking, yes, but is it actually accessible to the people who need to use captions? And as far as the director is concerned, the first time they may realize that the captions are wrong is when they see it on the screen. You know, it's because people are busy and people have moved on and people are promoting their projects. But yes, I think it's that trying to get a whole team approach, isn't it? But yeah, I think the sound is very much a kind of disconnect very often with the editor. And I mean, I remember doing a live performance in Austria, and I couldn't understand why nobody was laughing, because it was supposed to be funny. And apparently I only discovered afterwards that the translator was doing it as this, you know, I was telling the story of, you know, overcoming these barriers and ha ha ha. And it was, oh, she had this terrible time. you know, and it was, you know, if you're doing a live performance and you're seeing the audience kind of getting worse and worse and worse, and you're thinking, but why aren't they laughing? Why are they looking so horrified? You know, so I think all of these things, you know, we're very careful about who we get to do our interpretation, for example, in terms of British Sign Language, because again, it's that same thing. You just don't know what the prejudices of the person you're involving are unless you've done your homework. And I think that's the thing. But yes, there's nothing worse than trying to be really funny and having people just almost in tears just because of the way it's being translated, because that person is just assuming that your life is a tragedy and just wouldn't have occurred. You know, and I think this was Austria probably sort of at least 10, 15 years ago. I don't think it would have occurred to anybody that my life wasn't a tragedy, apart from possibly some of the people who invited me, and maybe not even then. But yeah, I think the captions, the translation, the music, it all impacts on how we receive the film. The description, I mean, we go through a platform called Film Freeway, and some of the descriptions, which of course are written in English, possibly by somebody completely different to the film crew, just dreadful. And you kind of know, actually, this is probably a really good film, or at least I'm going to watch it. But the summary of the film, oh dear, it's this tragic, brave, you know, this brave person in this terrible situation of being deaf has managed to overcome. And you think, I'll watch it anyway. You know, we will at least check the beginning and the middle and the end. And, you know, very often the description just does not do the film justice. But if you're a filmmaker who doesn't speak the language and you let somebody else do the translation, again, all of these prejudices creep back in. I did actually look at whether it was possible to test it, but I didn't have the time. But it made me wonder what an AI script for a disability film would look like, based on the kind of overwhelm. You know, if you process 1,763 films through AI, I think apart from the fact that you would get sad piano music with a bit of violin absolutely throughout, it wouldn't even be triumph over tragedy, because I would say the overwhelming majority of the 1,700 were tragic. So it would have a sad ending. It would have sad music, sad ending. None of the narration or the talking would be by the disabled person who was the subject of the film. And in fact, probably the carer would be the subject of the film. And then it would be kind of look at the tragedy of this carer's life. And we had quite a lot of films about the tragedy of being a carer, without any question about why they might have to not have any support, or indeed if it was tragedy. You know, you could see these lovely families, but the filmmaker had come in and see, you know, what they'd seen was the burden of care as they saw it. Karen Featherstone says disability AI is hilarious, and Jemima Hughes says that's an interesting idea. And Karen says, I mean, it really shouldn't be, but it's so awful we have to laugh. Kate Ellis says, I wondered if you had any films by people living with dementia or their carers and relatives. We didn't, I don't think. I mean, we certainly had some films, I think, entered. It's a little bit of a crossover sometimes, but, well, obviously, you know, you can't, 1,763 entries, most films are not going to be accepted. But sometimes it sort of falls into a disability film, and sometimes I think it falls more into a medical film. So it's also partly kind of the subject of the film. I haven't had any filmmakers who've identified themselves as living with dementia enter this year, although I do sit on various committees with people. You know, I mean, there's lots of younger people with dementia, for example, so we would certainly welcome it. What we have got, or yes, at the end of today's dance programme, there's a half-hour opera from people living with Parkinson's. And we put it in the dance programme because that was where opera kind of fitted most closely. And it does, of course, involve a lot of music and a lot of movement. But that's really interesting. It's by a female composer about a character called, a real life person called Margaret Catchpole. And that's people, I think about 90 adults from the Parkinson's community all over the UK came together to create that opera. So that's great. I'm just looking. So Kirby is saying, I think we need to keep doing things like this, unionising, keeping intersectional and helping each other. I'm so excited to check out all these links. And the high concept picture will either begin to properly include disabled people and flourish, or continue to prioritise moneymakers at the top and not creators below and simply dissolve, and will make something better in its wake. Wishful thinking may be, but I doubt any of us are going to stop making and doing cool things regardless. And that's awesome. I couldn't agree with you more, Kirby. And there's been some very, very positive aspects of this year's film festival. And in many, I think in every way, it's been the strongest yet, despite some of the sound. And I think the growth in intersectional films has been huge. So, for example, at the beginning of the artist films in today's programme, you have our very own Act Up Newham, and that's a film by mostly Black disabled people, people of colour, about the transatlantic slave trade in enslaved African peoples and the impact on our diet today. And that sort of links into a broader project. We've got a number of non-binary filmmakers. We've got more LGBT plus films than ever before. There's a fantastic documentary at the end of our COVID inquiry programme, Fire Through Dry Grass. And that's about a group of Black disabled male poets living in a care home, living in the kind of state care home in New York. And they're making a film about their poetry and their work, and then COVID hits. And it's the only film I think that's ever been made by care home residents about what was happening. And they were able to sort of film the difference between the reality of their lives kind of locked down in this centre and what was being said, which was a complete lie. Oh, we're not sending COVID patients there. And then, the COVID patients are being kept separately, and the COVID patients are being moved. And it only came out quite recently that numbers of deaths were actually double what the New York authorities admitted. So it's an amazing film. And it highlights all sorts of intersectional issues for the very first time. So I think it's part of that, that broader picture of disabled people's lives, that we've got fully rounded lives, and we've got all sorts of not other identities, because they're not separate identities. I always say I'm queer, I'm a woman, I'm disabled, and I'm a queer disabled woman. I don't live my life in these different little boxes. So yeah, I think the intersectionality, and indeed the number of non-binary filmmakers and LGBT plus filmmakers who've been entering, I think has been really encouraging. But now, I can't believe it, we only have 1 minute left. So I'd like to thank Carwyn, Reese, and everyone who's contributed to the discussion, our sign language interpreter, Chris Burrow, our captioner, Joanna Peter, the Together 2012 team members who've been helping me with the Zoom, our funders, Arts Council England, Film London, and National Lottery Community Fund, and all of you for coming today and contributing. Today's festival films are online until midday tomorrow. Well, that's Greenwich Mean Time, including artist films, dance films, dramas and documentaries, and a special programme for International Day of Disabled People. And we also have a special programme running all weekend that looks at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on deaf and hard of hearing people in the UK and on Black care home residents in the US. And finally, if it's accessible to you, because we didn't produce it, please do fill in the survey at the end of this event. It will really help us with securing funding for future festivals. And I look forward to seeing all of you again next year. Enjoy the rest of the festival and tell us what you think. We'd love your feedback on the guide. We'd love your feedback on the films. We'll be announcing the awards, Greenwich Mean Time tomorrow morning. So look out for the CAT Awards. And thank you very much indeed to Luke, if he's still here. Our awards are now IMDb accredited. So on that very positive note, I shall say thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you, Joe.
Oh.
You're welcome out.